video, we'll consider topics like VLookup, PivotTables, macros, etc. We'll start off by considering the VLookup. The basic idea of VLookup is that we look in a column to the left and find a value in a column to the right. For example, if we're going to look for Joe and find that Joe had £20, for example. So let's start off by typing in our VLookup. I always use small letters and it capitalizes it for me. The lookup value that I'm looking for is Joe. I'll put it in inverted commas because it's a piece of text. If it were a number, I would just leave it as a number. You can see that it's giving me hints down here. In bold it says table array. So this is the table array in which we are looking. Always put a comma in between each bit. So it's telling us now column index. Column index is the second column down here. That's where we want to find the result. If it were the third column where the data was, then you'd put 3. So let me put 2. And now it's coming up with true or false. Well, it's saying false exact match. Well, that's what we're looking for, an exact match for Joe. But we'll consider the true in just a moment. So now if I close off by closing the parenthesis, then that gives me the desired result. Let's try and make this a bit more general. If I want to be able to put my value in here and then find the result in here. So instead of Joe, I'm going to carefully highlight the Joe and then carefully click on F3. And you can see that it's being replaced in the formula up here at the top. So if I click OK, not available, it can't find nothing. So if I type Joe, you can see that the 20 appears, and if I type any of the others, then they appear. L, the result appears for L. You might like to consider something like this where you're finding a part number and looking for the cost. You could try that as an exercise. It's very much the same as what we just saw. But you might consider also that these, at the moment, it seems as if it's fairly simplistic. You might consider that it's got lots and lots of data like this where it's a little bit hard to find the stuff in down in that column. Well, that data might even be on another sheet. Let's try a numerical example. Let's say we're looking for the number 40 in this first column, which should correspond to 75. So we'll search for 40. We should end up with our answers being 75. Let's try that with our VLookup. So it's equals VLookup. Open the parentheses. What we're looking for is 40. So I'll just put the 40 without inverted commas since it's a number. The table array, which means this table here, and then a comma. And once again, we're looking in the second column. And then once again, I will try to find an exact match by using false. Easy to click on it. And then close off the parentheses. And you can see that that finds an exact match of 40, giving me 75. What if I were to look for something that wasn't there? So I look here, and I'm looking for 40 at the moment. Let's say that I look for 35. And because it says false, it means I'm trying to find an exact match. So when I run it, so to speak, it says that it's not available. Nowhere to be found is a 35. So what can I do about that? Well, I can find an approximate match. But the first thing we must do when we're doing that is these numbers here must be sorted in ascending order, not descending order. So I'm going to try and sort those in smallest to largest. Now, whenever we're using true in our formula, we must have them sorted from smallest to largest. So true means that I can find an approximate match. Now let's see if that works and how it works. It finds the number 65, which is the nearest match, but which nearest match? Above, below, what? Strangely enough, I like to imagine these as bookshelves, so that if I'm looking for 35, 35 is in between this bookshelf, this one here and this one here. So the 35 will be in here. And what I imagine it is doing is dropping back down to the previous bookshelf, which is the 30. So Excel VLookup always finds the one which is less than the required. So 35 we're looking for in between there and there. So it drops back to the 30 and finds the answer of 65. A more classic example would be when the data is already sorted for us. For example, if someone earns 1,200, they get 2% commission. If they earn 1,300, they still get 2% commission, and so on. Taking a look at the 1,500, you get 5%. If you get 1,600, you get 5% as well. So it's the idea of falling back to the previous bookshelf. Let's see if we can achieve that using VLookup. So once again, equals VLookup, and then the value that we're looking for, in this case, is 1,600. The table in which we're looking, comma, the column in which we want the result, which is 2, and then we have true, and then close, because we're looking for an approximate match, or the one beneath, and that returns our 5%. If I just format that as percentage, that's how we get our 5%. Incidentally, what happens if we get rid of the true here? Well, absolutely nothing, because true is the default. So if I delete it, you'll see the default situation is an approximate match. We'll consider now pivot tables. What does a pivot table look like? If we have an ordinary table of data like this, this is a pivot table. Well, what distinguishes a pivot table? Let's take a look at the data in here. New York, New York, London, and so on. Look, these here are headings. So we make headings of those, London and New York. But look in this column here, this data is repeated. So this data could constitute headings as well. And indeed, if you look at our pivot table, you see we have made headings of a column of data. And that's what a pivot table essentially is, because you can imagine that you are taking your data and pivoting it around so that so if you've got an imagination, you can see that the food and the clothing are sort of pivoted over to here to make headings as well. I'll just move this out of the way a bit, but we can just keep an eye on what we are trying to produce. So to make a pivot table, we go to Insert, Pivot Table, and then Pivot Table up on the top left here. Select the table. The table range is going to be the table here. Be careful, it's got on the existing worksheet. It might try and get you to get onto a new worksheet, existing worksheet, and this is where we're going to place our pivot table. So I'll click up here in I5, and that's our starting point. Now we've got the pivot table wizard, which helps us along, so we'll just choose all of those. It's looking like our pivot table, but it's a bit confused in here. Let's take a look at what we're trying to do. You see that the clothing and the food is across the top, which is a column label, column labels as corresponding here, and the store is the row label. So I need to basically move the department, which is the food and clothing, up to here. And you can see now that it looks like the pivot table that I was trying to achieve. That's a very simple example of a pivot table. You could experiment further, try out what happens if you select some of these or some of these over here and so on, and then you might get percentages, and you could group the food and the clothing into something else, and so on. So this is really just touching the surface of pivot tables, but I hope you get the general idea. Let's take a look now at macros. What is a macro? With a macro, you can do many things at once at the press of a key. So if I had some, for example, this simple macro here, which I've made already, when I press Control E, it does a few things. It makes a blue background, and it makes the text violet, which is a macro that I've already made. So that's the general idea. You press a key and lots of things happen at the one time. The first thing that you will need if you are recording macros is this thing here, which is the developer toolbar. So that won't appear by default on your Excel. So if you want that to appear, it's different for different versions, but for this version, if I go to Options, and then I go to Customize Ribbon, and you can see here the developer toolbar. So you need to check that. That's the first thing you need to do if you want to record a macro, or indeed write some VBA. So let's record a macro. We'll make a macro to make something bold and underlined when I press the Control Z key, for example. So on the developer in the ribbon, we record a macro up here. Now if I try that, it's macro 2 or whatever, and the key that I'm going to use is Control Z to run the macro. And be careful with this. It says this workbook. There is an option of personal macro that can get you into all sorts of trouble. So make sure that you be specific and ask to record in this workbook, and then click OK. Now you'll see that we are recording because it says up here stop recording, so which we'll eventually do. So now we need to go through all the hoops of what we're going to want to do. So as I mentioned, we said we want to make something bold and underlined. That'll do us for the moment. You could color it, right align it, left align it, all sorts of things. So that's fine by me. So I'm going to now click the developer in the ribbon. I'm going to stop recording and breathe a sigh of relief, because if you make an error, it records all your errors as well. I'm now ready to test the macro. So if I have a bit of text and numbers or text or whatever, and I highlight it, and then I do my Control Z, you see it runs the macro and does both of those things, makes it bold and underlined. Even if I had a bit of text over here, or numbers or whatever, and then I tried my macro on that, then Control Z, and it will do that to all of the cells. Let's take a look at the macro code. There are two ways we could look at it, and that's through here, Visual Basic or or macros. I'll choose macros for the moment. There's my macro, macro 2, so I can take a look at it by pressing Edit. This is the language of VBA that macros is written in. I could actually do a little bit of programming here because it's saying make it bold. Well, if I change that to false and then run it, well, I can close that completely now. And if I were to click on one of these and run my macro by pressing Ctrl-Z, you see it makes it unbold. It still does the underlining, but it makes it unbold. So there you are. You've done a bit of VBA programming. You see that VBA is the language behind macros. To learn VBA programming does require 25 hours of hard work, but it's very worthwhile. When Excel won't behave the way you want it to, and you want to modify the behavior of Excel, then you would use VBA from scratch.